Marcus Chen was not the kind of teenager who paid attention during flights. At 17, with his dark hair falling across his forehead and earbuds perpetually inserted, he existed in his own world, a world of aerospace simulations, vintage engine schematics, and the kind of technical knowledge that made him an outsider at Lincoln High School. Flight 447 from Los Angeles to Denver was supposed to be uneventful. 4 hours of peace. Time to review the Boeing 737 manual he downloaded, the one that detailed systems most casual passengers would never think about. He'd already memorized the basics, the hydraulic systems, the dual redundancies designed to keep planes in the sky even when things went catastrophically wrong. He believed in redundancy. He believed in engineering. He believed that systems, properly designed, almost never failed. He was about to learn what almost meant. Marcus pressed his forehead against the window at 28,000 feet, watching the landscape of clouds below. It was 2:47 p.m., and the afternoon light cast everything in shades of white and gold. The ride had been smooth for the past hour, that kind of smooth flight where you forget you're in the air at all, where the world seems suspended in a bubble of normalcy. His mother had been a flight instructor once. She taught him that the safest place to be was in an aircraft. Statistically, driving to the airport was more dangerous than flying across the country. Numbers didn't lie. Mathematics was the language of the universe, and the universe had decided that Flight 447 would arrive safely in Denver at 4:15 p.m. local time. That was before 2:48 p.m. The first sign was subtle, a slight vibration that didn't belong. Marcus felt it through the armrest before he heard anything, a tremor that ran through the entire fuselage like a dog shaking off water. He pulled one earbud out. Around him, a few other passengers seemed to notice it too. A businessman 3 rows ahead glanced up from his laptop. An elderly woman clutched her purse a little tighter. But the flight attendants continued their work, moving through the cabin with the practiced grace of people who'd done this thousands of times. Nothing was wrong. It was probably just wind shear or a pocket of turbulence. The captain would adjust altitude. Then came the sound. It wasn't loud, not exactly. It was worse than loud. It was a grinding, metallic shriek that seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the walls, the floor, the very bones of the aircraft. It was the sound of something that was supposed to stay together coming undone. Marcus's coffee, sitting in the cup holder beside him, rippled. A passenger across the aisle gasped. A child in the back of the plane started crying. The aircraft lurched. Not a gentle dip, not a bump. A violent shudder that sent Marcus's stomach into his throat and knocked a water bottle off the tray table of the passenger in front of him. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling compartments like mechanical jellyfish, hanging by their plastic tubes. The sound of people screaming came from the back of the plane, not screams of surprise, but of genuine terror. An alarm began to wail, high-pitched and relentless, the kind of alarm that existed for one reason only: to tell everyone that something had gone catastrophically wrong. In that moment, Marcus understood why the universe had redundancy, because it had just used the first one up. The aircraft's nose tilted downward, not gradually, not the way a plane was supposed to descend during an approach to an airport, but sharply, aggressively, like the finger of an angry god pushing the entire aircraft toward the earth. The overhead bins popped open. Luggage tumbled into the aisles. A woman in seat 14A was thrown forward against her seatbelt, her hands instinctively reaching for anything stable. The elderly man next to Marcus gripped the armrest so hard his knuckles turned white, and Marcus realized that his own hands were doing the same thing. "Ladies and gentlemen," a voice crackled through the speakers, and even through the distortion and the screaming and the roar of wind outside the fuselage, Marcus could hear that something was desperately wrong. The captain's voice, it had been professional and warm during the pre-flight announcement, the kind of voice that said, "Everything is fine, you can sleep now, I've got this." But that voice was gone. What came through now was the voice of a man in the middle of a fight with physics itself. We are experiencing a temporary issue. Please remain calm and keep your seatbelts fastened. Temporary. That was the word they used. Marcus had read enough about aviation disasters to know what temporary really meant in this context. It meant we don't know if we're going to survive. It meant the pilots didn't want to trigger a panic before they knew if there even was one. It meant that in the next few minutes, something would happen that would either be remembered as a crisis averted or as the last moments of everyone on this aircraft. At 27,000 feet, Flight 447 continued its descent. The alarm wailed on. Passengers prayed. Some called their families, those lucky enough to get a signal, and left messages that might never be heard. A mother 3 rows back pulled her son close and whispered that everything would be okay, and both of them knew she was lying. In the cockpit, Captain James Reeves was 62 years old. He had logged more than 22,000 flight hours. He had seen hydraulic failures, electrical problems, engine shutdowns, structural issues. He had trained for emergencies in simulators and faced them in reality. He considered himself a professional in the truest sense of the word. But as he stared at the array of warning lights illuminating his instrument panel like a Christmas tree from hell, he understood that he'd never seen this specific combination of failures before. Engine 1, losing power. Engine 2, losing power faster. Hydraulics, cascading failure. And below them, 187 people were falling out of the sky. He took a breath and did what every pilot is trained to do. He fought. His hands moved across the controls with the precision of a surgeon, the determination of someone who'd spent 4 decades learning how to ask machines to do impossible things. "Sarah," he said to First Officer Sarah Chen, and his voice was steady now, focused. "Call it out." "Electrical feedback on secondary systems," she responded, her own hands flying across her controls. "Hydraulic pressure dropping. Backup systems activating. Captain, I'm not seeing recovery on either engine." At 25,000 feet, the aircraft continued its descent. Below them, the mountains of Colorado were approaching. Captain Reeves made a decision that would define the next hour of everyone's lives. "We're going to find a landing zone," he said, "and we're going to bring this bird down." Above them, unknown to anyone in the aircraft, 2 F-16 fighter jets were being scrambled from a nearby airbase. Below them, a 17-year-old boy with a knowledge of engines was about to become the only person who could save them all. Captain James Reeves had always believed that flying was the safest form of human travel. The statistics proved it. The redundancies proved it. The systems, upon systems all working together in perfect harmony proved it. A Boeing 737 was built with so much redundancy that losing a single system meant nothing. Losing 2 systems was manageable. The aircraft was designed to fly on one engine if necessary. Hydraulics had backups. Electrical systems had backups. Even the backups had backups. This was why millions of people flew every single day without a second thought. Reeves had built his entire professional identity on this principle. The system works. But as he stared at the illuminated warning panel in front of him at 25,000 feet, he was beginning to understand the terrifying truth that every experienced pilot eventually learns. The system works right up until the moment it doesn't. "Mayday, Denver approach. This is Flight 447, he said into the radio, his voice calm and measured despite the adrenaline burning through his veins. "We are experiencing dual engine failure and multiple system cascades. We are declaring an emergency and requesting immediate vectors for the nearest suitable landing area." There was a beat of silence. He could almost hear Denver Air Traffic Control's collective intake of breath through the speaker. Dual engine failure on a commercial aircraft was not supposed to happen. Single engine failures, yes, they happened occasionally, and the aircraft responded perfectly, flying smoothly on the remaining engine while the crew worked through the checklist. But 2 engines at once, that wasn't in the normal playbook. That was the nightmare scenario that pilots trained for in simulators, but secretly hoped they'd never encounter in real life. "Copy that, Flight 447, came the response, and Reeves could hear the strain in the controller's voice now. "We're showing your position. Nearest airport is Greeley Regional, approximately 110 miles to your northeast. Can you maintain altitude?" Reeves looked at the altimeter, 24,000 feet and dropping. The rate of descent was 2,000 feet per minute and accelerating. At that rate, he had maybe 10 minutes before they ran out of sky. 10 minutes to solve problems that had taken hundreds of engineers years to prevent. "Negative, Denver," he said. "Descent rate is 2,000 feet per minute and increasing. We're going to look for a remote landing area. Stand by." First Officer Sarah Chen was already pulling up terrain maps on the navigation display. Her face had gone pale, but her hands remained steady. This was what they trained for. This was why they practiced emergency procedures until they could execute them in their sleep. But there was a difference between practicing and living, between a simulator and a cockpit where every system was screaming in protest. "Captain, electrical feedback on secondary systems," she called out, her voice tight and controlled. "Backup hydraulic pressure is dropping. Primary hydraulics are now at 15%. 15%. Reeves felt a cold knot form in his chest. Hydraulics were what moved the control surfaces, the flaps, the slats, the rudder. 15% meant they were operating on fumes. If the hydraulics failed completely, the aircraft would become nothing more than a heavy projectile. "I'm routing power through tertiary circuits," Sarah continued, her fingers flying across the switches in front of her. "Still losing pressure. It's like we're hemorrhaging from every direction at once." That was when Reeves understood the true nature of their situation. This wasn't a simple failure. Simple failures happened one at a time. You lost an engine, you flew on the other. You lost hydraulic pressure, you switched to backup. But this was a cascade. This was systems failing in a chain reaction, each failure triggering the next like dominoes falling in the dark. Something had gone fundamentally wrong with the aircraft, and whatever it was coordinating its destruction perfectly. At 23,000 feet, the nose tilted down a few more degrees. In the cabin behind him, Reeves could hear the roar of frightened passengers. He'd learned long ago to tune out the chaos behind the cockpit door. Panic spread like a virus. If the crew stayed calm, the passengers would eventually follow. If the crew panicked, 187 people would descend into absolute terror. He had to stay calm. Even if the world was ending, he had to stay calm. "Sarah, give me the emergency landing checklist," he commanded. "We're going to prep this aircraft for a forced landing." The checklist. There was comfort in procedure. In a world where systems were failing faster than he could track, the checklist remained constant. It was a roadmap written by people who had spent their entire careers thinking about what to do when everything went wrong. Reeves and Chen had done this checklist hundreds of times in the simulator. They could do it in their sleep. But in the simulator, the engines didn't actually fail. In the simulator, you could always restart them. In the simulator, you didn't have 187 real people whose lives depended on your ability to memorize a piece of paper. "Fuel pumps on auto," Sarah recited. "Ignition switches on. Battery power to backup systems. Captain, I'm reading multiple cascade failures in the electrical architecture. It's like something is triggering a chain reaction." Reeves's mind raced. A manufacturing defect, a structural failure, something they'd hit during flight that had damaged critical systems simultaneously. It didn't matter right now. What mattered was that they had minutes to solve a problem that specialists took days to diagnose. "Denver, this is Flight 447, he said. "We're going to attempt a landing in the remote area near the Colorado-Wyoming border. We need emergency services standing by for a potential crash landing. Multiple systems are compromised. We may not have full hydraulic control during descent." "Copy that, Flight 447, Denver responded. "We're clearing the area and coordinating with local emergency services. What is your current altitude and descent rate?" 22,000 feet, descent rate 2,200 feet per minute, Sarah answered without waiting for Reeves to ask. That was why they worked so well together. They understood each other's needs before the needs were voiced. Estimated time to terrain, impact approximately 8 minutes if we don't arrest the descent. 8 minutes? Reeves made another decision. He wasn't going to be able to restart these engines with conventional procedures. That much was becoming obvious. The system was too compromised. But that didn't mean they were dead yet. Not if they could get the aircraft to level off. Not if they could find a suitable landing area. "I'm setting a new heading," he said, banking the aircraft slightly. "Looking for flat terrain. Mountain valleys won't work. We need space." The aircraft groaned in protest as it made the turn. Something in the tail section made a sound that Reeves had never heard in 30 years of flying. A sound that suggested metal was tearing. Structures were separating. The aircraft itself was coming apart from the inside out. At 21,000 feet, the descent continued. At 20,000 feet, Sarah was running through diagnostics that showed failures in systems that weren't supposed to fail together. Power distribution problems, electrical feedback loops, something that looked almost like sabotage, except this was modern aviation, and modern aviation didn't get sabotaged. It engineered itself to death. At 19,000 feet, Captain Reeves spotted it, a vast, flat valley below them, remote enough that a crash landing wouldn't threaten a population center. It wasn't perfect. But in that moment, with the aircraft falling from the sky and every system failing in sequence, perfect wasn't an option. "I've got a landing zone," he announced, initiating approach descent. Behind him, 187 people prepared to live or die based on what happened in the next few minutes. And none of them knew that a 17-year-old boy in seat 12C was about to become the only reason any of them would survive what came next. Marcus Chen had exactly 1.2 seconds to make a decision that would define the rest of his life. He sat in seat 12C, hands gripping the armrest as another violent shudder ran through the fuselage. Around him, people were screaming. A woman across the aisle was hyperventilating into her hands. A businessman 2 rows ahead was praying, actually praying, his lips moving silently, something Marcus had never seen an adult do outside of a church. And somewhere behind him, a child was crying with the particular intensity that only children can achieve when their world has stopped making sense. The alarm continued its relentless wail. Marcus's mind was moving faster than his body. This was what happened when you spent 3 years immersed in aerospace engineering, while your peers were worrying about prom dates and college applications. You learned to think systematically about catastrophe. You understood systems. And right now, his entire system of knowledge was telling him something that seemed insane. He knew what was wrong with this plane. It wasn't a certainty, not yet. It was an educated guess based on a grinding sound that had lasted maybe 2 seconds before the engine seemed to lose power. A sound he'd heard before, in a garage in suburban Denver, while his father cursed at a Cessna engine that refused to start. His father, Dr. Michael Chen, the retired aerospace engineer who'd spent 30 years designing fuel injection systems for commercial aircraft before he'd retired to tinker with vintage airplanes. His father, who'd been so frustrated with that particular Cessna that he'd spent 2 months researching manufacturing defects from the 1960s, comparing specs, troubleshooting problems that engineers half a century ago had faced and sometimes failed to solve properly. Marcus had been there for every moment of it. He'd learned the systems, the failures, the workarounds. His mother had been a flight instructor once. Before Marcus was born, before she decided to focus on raising him and writing about aviation safety, she'd spent 4,700 hours in the air, teaching other people how to fly. She taught Marcus that fear was information. Fear meant something was wrong. and the job of a pilot was to figure out what that something was before it killed you. Right now, Marcus's fear was screaming information at him. The aircraft descended through 20,000 feet. The oxygen in the cabin felt thin. Marcus's own breathing had become rapid and shallow. His phone was in his hand before he'd fully decided to pull it out, a habit from 1,000 flights just in case. Most commercial aircraft didn't have Wi-Fi. Flight 447 did, because it was a relatively new aircraft with all the modern amenities. That was supposed to be a good thing. That was supposed to mean connectivity and comfort. Right now, Marcus was thinking of it as his only lifeline. He opened the emergency Wi-Fi network that appeared automatically on any connected device. Most people didn't know it existed. Most people would die in an aircraft emergency without ever knowing that there was a way to contact the outside world. But Marcus had read the safety briefing card. Twice. He'd absorbed every detail about emergency procedures, exit rows, and emergency contact protocols. While other kids were sleeping, he was studying how not to die. The Wi-Fi network was labeled Aircraft Emergency Contact. He opened his browser. His hands were shaking so badly that he could barely type. The page loaded, a simple form with fields for name, passenger information, and message. Above it, a single line of text. This channel is monitored by air traffic control. Use only in genuine emergencies. Marcus's heart was hammering so hard he was sure everyone around him could hear it. This was insane. This was absolutely insane. He was a 17-year-old kid. He watched YouTube videos about aircraft systems. He built engine models in his garage. He'd never set foot in a real cockpit. His experience was theoretical, simulated, borrowed from the expertise of people who'd actually spent decades in aviation. But the aircraft was falling. At 19,000 feet now, and dropping. And somewhere in the cockpit, professional pilots who trained for every scenario they could imagine were facing something that maybe they hadn't trained for, maybe something they didn't understand. Because that sound, that grinding, metallic shriek, wasn't a normal engine failure sound. It was something else. It was the sound of a precision system that had been manufactured with a flaw, a defect so specific that it probably only showed up under very particular conditions. Conditions like flying at 28,000 feet, with particular fuel mixture ratios, and airflow patterns and temperatures. Marcus began typing. Air traffic control, this is Marcus Chen, passenger 12C, flight 447 from Lax to Denver. I believe I've identified the cause of the engine failure. This is not a hoax. My name and seat number can be verified. My father is a retired aerospace engineer. My mother is a former flight instructor with 4,700 hours of experience. I have spent 3 years studying aircraft systems, including fuel injection systems and their known defects. I have 40 hours of logged flight simulator time. I believe your primary engines are experiencing dual fuel injection system failure, specifically a secondary pump lock that occurs under high-altitude conditions. The defect is documented in legacy aircraft manuals from the 1960s. There is a manual restart sequence that can bypass the lock and restore engine function. I can guide your flight crew through it. Please respond immediately. Time is critical. He stared at the message. It sounded crazy. It sounded like the kind of prank message that air traffic controllers received all the time, probably from people who'd had too much to drink or were trying to cause panic. Why would anyone believe a teenager? But the alternative was silence. The alternative was sitting in his seat and letting the aircraft fall and doing nothing. Marcus hit send. The message disappeared into the wireless void, transmitted through the emergency network toward whatever tower or control center was monitoring this channel. For one breathless second, nothing happened. The alarm continued. The aircraft continued its descent. Around him, people continued their panic. Then something miraculous occurred. Not a response, not yet, but a small indicator on his screen. Message received, stand by. Marcus's breath caught in his chest. Someone had seen it. Someone was reading his message right now. Someone was deciding whether to dismiss him as a crazy kid or to take him seriously. He thought of his father, working late into the night on that Cessna. He thought of his mother, calmly explaining aerodynamic principles while taking a turn at 3,000 feet. He thought of every video he'd watched, every manual he'd studied, every hour he'd spent learning systems that most people never thought about. He thought of 187 people on this aircraft. At 18,000 feet, the aircraft continued its descent, but Marcus was no longer just a passenger. He was suddenly, impossibly, a participant in his own survival. The indicator on his phone changed. Acknowledge what is your evidence. Marcus's fingers moved across the keyboard with desperate speed, knowing he had seconds to convince a stranger to believe him, to convince them that a kid with theoretical knowledge was their only hope. Below them, the ground was getting closer. Derek Thompson had been an air traffic controller for 23 years, and in those 23 years, he had learned to trust his instincts about people. He could hear panic in a pilot's voice from 300 miles away. He could detect deception in radio chatter. He could sense when someone was lying, and he could sense when someone was telling the truth, even when their story was completely insane. The message from Marcus Chen was insane. But it was also true. Derek had seen the telemetry data for Flight 447. He'd watched the dual-engine failure cascade in real time on his screen. He'd heard Captain Reeves' voice remain steady while describing failures that shouldn't happen simultaneously. And when he read the message from a 17-year-old passenger describing a specific fuel injection system defect that matched exactly with the signature of what was happening to those engines, Derek made a decision that would either save 187 lives or mark him as the controller who wasted critical minutes on a teenager's fantasy. He typed back, "Marcus, if you're certain about this, I need specifics. What defect? Where did you learn about it?" The response came back in seconds. 1960s Cessna manufacturing series. Secondary fuel pump lock occurs under high-altitude decompression combined with specific fuel mixture ratios. My father rebuilt a Cessna with this exact issue. Legacy, manual designation. Lufthansa Service Bulletin 701847. My father has the blueprints. I was there when he diagnosed it. Derek's hands moved across his communication panel with practiced precision. He had 3 decisions to make in the next 30 seconds. First, whether to trust this kid. Second, whether to contact Captain Reeves with information that might be completely wrong. Third, whether the cost of being wrong was worth the potential benefit of being right. The aircraft was at 17,000 feet and falling. They had minutes. Derek made his choice. "Flight 447, Denver approach," he said into his headset, his voice calm and professional despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "We have additional technical support standing by. A passenger on board has aerospace engineering background and believes they've identified your issue. Should we connect?" There was a brief pause. Derek could almost hear the gears turning in Captain Reeves' mind. A passenger, in the middle of an emergency, it violated every protocol. It was unprofessional. It was insane. "What kind of support?" came Reeves' voice, clipped and focused. "Aerospace systems knowledge, specific to your current symptoms," Derek said. "Sir, I wouldn't recommend this unless I believed there was merit." Another pause, longer this time. Derek could picture Reeves and Chen in the cockpit, exchanging looks, making a rapid calculation about risk versus reward. They were already in the worst-case scenario. What was the harm in listening to a kid? "Connect them," Reeves finally said. "Now." Derek patched the call through the emergency Wi-Fi system directly to the cockpit radio. He heard the connection establish, heard the slight static of digital communication bleeding through analog systems, heard Captain Reeves' voice again, this time more skeptical than before. "Kid, if you're wasting my time," Reeves began. "It's your fuel injection system," Marcus interrupted, his voice steady in a way that made Derek pause. This kid wasn't panicked. This kid wasn't trying to be a hero. This kid sounded like someone who'd done this calculation before in his garage with his father. There's a manufacturing defect. The secondary pump is locked. I've read about this in legacy aircraft manuals. My dad has blueprints. He rebuilt a 1967 Cessna with the exact same issue. Derek watched the radar screen, watching Flight 447's descent rate. 16,000 feet, still falling, still accelerating toward impact. In the cockpit, Captain Reeves' skepticism was warring with something else. The desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, this kid actually knew something useful. "How could you possibly know that?" Sarah Chen's voice came through the radio. Her voice was tight, controlled, but there was an edge to it that suggested she was working very hard to maintain her composure. "Because the sound the engines made when they failed, that grinding shriek," Marcus said. "I heard that exact sound when my father was troubleshooting the Cessna. It's not a normal engine failure. Normal failures are either catastrophic explosions or gradual losses of power. This is something else. This is a mechanical lock, something in the system refusing to function because it was built with a flaw." Derek listened to this exchange, and something in Marcus' voice convinced him that the kid had seen something no amount of YouTube videos could teach. He had hands-on experience. He had stood in a garage and watched a real airplane engine fail in exactly this way. "Give me the sequence," Captain Reeves said, and Derek heard the decision in those 5 words. Reeves was choosing to believe. Whether out of desperation or actual faith in Marcus' knowledge, he was choosing to act. "Primary pump cutoff first," Marcus said. "On Flight 447, that should be the switch in the overhead panel, 3rd row left side. Can you see it?" "I see it," Sarah confirmed. "Flip it off," Marcus instructed. "Wait 3 seconds. Count them out loud so I can hear you. I need to know you're following the sequence exactly." Derek watched the radar. 15,000 feet. The descent rate had slowed slightly. Maybe the pilots had adjusted trim. Maybe the aircraft had settled into a glide pattern. Either way, they were running out of runway. In the cockpit, Sarah began counting. 1, 2, 3. "Now," Marcus said, "reroute the system through the auxiliary manifold. The manual should show you the diverter valve. It's below the primary pump." "I'm finding it," Sarah said. Her voice had changed. The skepticism was gone. She was fully engaged now, following instructions from a teenager she couldn't see, in a system she'd never had to manually reconfigure in actual flight. Captain Reeves remained silent, but Derek knew what he was doing. He was monitoring Sarah's actions, checking them, ready to override if this went wrong. He was the safety net. Marcus was the map. And between them, they were attempting something that had never been done before, saving an aircraft using emergency procedures that had been designed for aircraft built before commercial aviation had even developed the safety protocols that Reeves had spent his career trusting. "You're going to feel resistance around step 5, Marcus said. "Don't stop, don't give up, trust the system." Those last 3 words, "trust the system," seemed to carry weight that transcended the emergency. They were an affirmation, a belief. A 17-year-old kid with grease under his fingernails from working in his father's garage, telling experienced pilots to trust the engineering that had been done decades ago by people who'd faced this exact problem and solved it. "I'm at the resistance," Sarah reported. "Push through," Marcus said. "The lock is designed to disengage after moderate pressure is applied. It's a failsafe that activates under decompression. You're going to feel it click when it disengages. That's the sound you want to hear." Derek listened to the radio silence, waiting for that sound that would mean Marcus was right, that a teenager had just saved 187 people through knowledge and calm and belief in engineering that had been tested 60 years ago. At 14,000 feet, Flight 447 continued its descent. And Derek Thompson, an air traffic controller who had been skeptical just minutes before, found himself holding his breath, and praying to a god he didn't believe in that a kid in seat 12C knew exactly what he was talking about. Major Tom Stevens had scrambled his F-16 fighter jet exactly 17 minutes earlier, responding to an emergency call that had the kind of urgency that made his adrenaline spike. A commercial aircraft in distress. Dual engine failure. 187 people on board. His mission was simple: intercept the aircraft, assess its condition, and relay information back to the emergency response teams coordinating on the ground. It was not a rescue mission. F-16s didn't rescue airplanes. F-16s were built for combat, for speed, for engaging targets at distances that would make most people dizzy. The idea of using a fighter jet to help save a commercial aircraft was like using a sniper rifle to perform surgery. You could probably do it, but it wasn't what the tool was designed for. But that was what the military did in moments like this. They adapted. His wingman, Captain Lisa Rodriguez, kept pace with him as they streaked through the sky at 25,000 feet. Their instruments showed Flight 447 ahead, still descending, still losing altitude faster than any aircraft should be able to. On paper, what was happening shouldn't be possible. Modern aircraft didn't just lose power like this. Modern aircraft had redundancies. They had fail-safes. They had systems designed to keep them in the air, even when things went catastrophically wrong. Yet here was Flight 447, proving that the impossible was happening. Flight 447, this is Viper 11, F-16 escort, Stevens said into his radio, using his call sign. We have visual contact. We're going to maintain position alongside you and relay information to emergency services. How are you holding up? The response came back from Captain Reeves, and Stevens could hear the strain in his voice, but also something else. A kind of desperate focus that Stevens recognized from his own experiences in the cockpit. This was a pilot who was in the zone, making decisions that would determine whether 187 people lived or died. Copy that, Viper 11, Reeves said. We've got a passenger who's walking us through a manual restart sequence for the fuel injection system. It's unconventional, but it's our only shot. Stevens blinked. A passenger. In the middle of an emergency restart procedure. That was the kind of thing that violated every protocol, every procedure, every standard that had been established by decades of aviation safety regulations. And yet, Stevens had learned during his 15 years of military flying that sometimes the most dangerous situations required the most unconventional solutions. Copy that, Stevens said. We're monitoring your descent rate. You've got approximately 8 minutes at current rate of descent before terrain becomes an issue. What's your status on the restart sequence? In progress, came Reeves' response. First step complete. Moving to the auxiliary manifold reroute now. Rodriguez pulled her F-16 slightly closer, matching Flight 447's descent trajectory. The commercial aircraft looked enormous from this angle, massive, heavy, and increasingly vulnerable as it descended toward terrain that would have no mercy. Rodriguez had flown plenty of combat missions, had seen things that would haunt most people for the rest of their lives. But watching a commercial airliner with hundreds of innocent people on board descending helplessly toward the ground was different from combat. This wasn't an enemy. This was people, families, children. They've got a kid helping them, Rodriguez said over the radio to Stevens. Did you catch that? A passenger is walking them through a restart sequence. I caught it, Stevens said. His eyes were fixed on the aircraft. He could see the contrails from the remaining engines, could see the angle of descent getting steeper. Every second that passed was altitude lost. Every second was another opportunity for something else to go wrong. At 13,000 feet, Flight 447 was still falling. Come on, Stevens whispered, as if his faith and concentration could somehow change physics. In the cockpit of Flight 447, Marcus Chen was repeating the sequence for the third time, his voice steady even though his hands were shaking so badly that he could barely hold the phone. Sarah Chen had her hands on the controls, executing every step Marcus described. Captain Reeves was monitoring altitude, monitoring descent rate, monitoring a dozen other factors that would determine whether this worked or whether they were all about to become a statistic in aviation history. Resistance around step 5, Marcus said again. Don't stop. The lock is designed to disengage under pressure. You're going to feel it click when it releases. Sarah's jaw was clenched. Her eyes were locked on the fuel system readout. She could feel the resistance Marcus had described, could feel the mechanical lock refusing to give way. This was it. This was the moment when faith met engineering, when a procedure designed for a 1960s Cessna had to work on a modern Boeing 737 at 13,000 feet, with 187 lives hanging in the balance. She pushed harder, and then it came, a click so subtle that most people would have missed it, but Sarah Chen had spent 15 years flying aircraft, and she heard it. I feel it, she said. The lock released. From his position alongside Flight 447, Major Stevens saw something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The left engine, which had been dark and quiet, suddenly erupted with light and fire. Not the violent explosion of an uncontrolled ignition, but the controlled burn of an engine coming to life. The engine roared. It was a sound that Stevens had heard thousands of times, the sound of an aircraft engine operating at full capacity, the sound that meant power, that meant lift, that meant survival. But hearing it in this context, in this moment, hearing it come back to life when it should have been dead, it sounded like a miracle. Viper 1-1, we've got engine 1, Captain Reeves' voice crackled through the radio, and Stevens could hear something new in that voice, not confidence yet, but the beginning of hope. Rodriguez pulled her aircraft slightly closer, and through her canopy, she could see passengers in the windows of Flight 447. She could see faces pressed against the glass, could see people realizing that the impossible had just happened, that an engine that had failed was running again, that they weren't going to die today. Outstanding, Stevens said, his voice controlled but his heart pounding. We have visual confirmation of engine 1 engagement. What's your descent rate? Still falling, Reeves reported, but the descent rate is slowing. Flight 447 is responding to trim adjustment. We've got maybe, he paused, maybe a chance now. Stevens watched the altitude readout, 12,000 feet, still dropping but more slowly now. The aircraft's physics had changed. With one engine operating, it could at least generate lift. It could glide. It could potentially reach a runway. Flight 447, you're doing great, Stevens said, and he meant it. This was the most remarkable thing he'd ever witnessed, not in combat, not in training, but right now. A commercial aircraft brought back from the brink of disaster by an experienced pilot, a capable crew, and a teenager who knew something that nobody else on the planet knew. Let's get your second engine running and get you on the ground, Stevens said. In his jet, Captain Rodriguez was already thinking ahead, calculating landing distances, identifying alternate airfields, doing the math of survival. She'd been trained for combat scenarios, for split-second decisions that meant life or death. But this was something else entirely. This was people working together to beat physics, to refuse the inevitable, to choose survival over surrender. At 11,000 feet, Flight 447 continued its descent. But it was no longer falling. It was flying. The left engine was running. The needle on Captain Reeves' instrument panel confirmed it, power output steady at 70%, performance nominal, systems responding correctly. It should have felt like victory. It should have felt like salvation. It felt like a reprieve, nothing more. Because the right engine was still dead. And with only one engine operational, Flight 447 was still in a precarious position. One engine could keep an aircraft in the sky, technically. One engine could generate enough thrust to maintain altitude under ideal conditions. But they weren't at ideal altitude. They were at 11,000 feet and still descending, still bleeding airspeed, still fighting against gravity and the physics of a massive aircraft that had been built to fly on two engines, not one. Right engine is not responding to the restart sequence, Sarah Chen reported, her voice tight. I've tried 3 times. It's like the secondary pump lock is engaging faster than we can get past it. Marcus heard this through the phone line, and his mind was already moving ahead to the next problem. The fuel injection system had a single point of failure. If one engine had the lock, the second one would too. But why wasn't the second engine accepting the restart sequence? Sarah had used the exact same procedure Marcus had provided. It had worked for the left engine. Why wouldn't it work for the right? And then the answer came to him. A possibility so dangerous that he almost didn't voice it. There's an electrical feedback loop, Marcus said, speaking slowly, forcing himself to think through the problem rather than react to the emergency. When the first engine locked, it probably triggered an overload in the electrical architecture. The secondary restart system is trying to engage, but it's getting feedback that tells it to shut down immediately. It's a safeguard, designed to prevent electrical fires, but it's also preventing restart. Sarah's voice came back through the radio. How do we bypass it? Marcus took a breath. His father had told him once that every system had a failure mode, and every failure mode had a solution. But some solutions were more dangerous than others. You need to power down the entire electrical architecture, Marcus said. All of it. I know it sounds insane, but the only way to reset the feedback loop is to shut down everything and let the backup systems engage from a clean state. In the cockpit, Captain Reeves and Sarah Chen exchanged a look. They had trained for many emergencies. They had never trained for an emergency that required deliberately shutting down all power to the aircraft at 11,000 feet. If we power down everything, we lose the instruments, Sarah said. We lose navigation, we lose radio. You'll have backup power, Marcus said. The emergency systems will engage automatically. You'll get basic instruments back. Altitude, airspeed, heading, that's all you'll need. That's insane, Reeves said, but he was already reaching for the master electrical switch. It's the only way, Marcus replied. From his position alongside Flight 447, Major Stevens watched the aircraft carefully. He saw the lights in the cabin flicker. He saw the navigation lights dim slightly. Something was happening down there, something that had the signature of a controlled systems failure. Flight 447, you're losing power signature, Stevens said. What's your status? For one terrible moment there was no response. No radio, no acknowledgement. Stevens felt his stomach drop. Had something gone wrong? Had they made the situation worse? Then Captain Reeves' voice came back through the radio, and it was different now. It was the voice of someone who had just stepped into the void and was hopping the ground was still beneath him. We're executing a full electrical system reset, Reeves said. This is going to be rough. Stand by. In the cockpit, the lights had gone out. The instruments were dark. The navigation display was black. The only illumination was the emergency lighting, dim red panels that cast everything in a hellish glow. Sarah gripped the control yoke, flying the aircraft on pure instinct and faith. Captain Reeves reached toward the master electrical switch, his hand moving with the certainty of someone who had made a decision and was committed to seeing it through. He held down the switch for 5 seconds. The electrical systems shut down. The aircraft went completely dark for one breathless moment. Then the backup systems engaged and the emergency instrumentation came to life. Basic flight instruments, essential systems only, everything else was gone. Come on, Marcus whispered from seat 12C, as if his will could force the systems to respond correctly. The electrical feedback loop was resetting. The secondary pump lock on the right engine was receiving no signal. It was disengaging. The restart sequence was being accepted. Right engine, Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly as she executed the restart procedure. Primary pump cutoff. Auxiliary manifold reroute. I'm going through the sequence. Marcus guided her through it step by step, his voice steady even though his heart was pounding so hard he was sure everyone around him could hear it. The passenger next to him was gripping his armrest, tears streaming down her face. The businessman across the aisle was praying again, his lips moving silently. Everyone on the aircraft had figured out what was happening. The only thing keeping them alive was a teenager with theoretical knowledge and experienced pilots with nothing left to lose. At 10,000 feet, Flight 447 was still descending. "Resistance," Sarah called out. "I feel the resistance around Step 5. "Push through," Marcus said. "The lock is the same as the first engine. It's designed to disengage under pressure. Don't stop, don't give up, trust it." Sarah pushed harder. Her hands were shaking, but her will was absolute. This was what she had trained for, not the specific situation, but the principle of refusing to accept defeat when people's lives depended on her competence. The resistance grew. The mechanical lock was fighting back, refusing to yield. Then a click, unmistakable, identical to the sound from the left engine. The right engine roared to life. Through the darkened cockpit, Captain Reeves felt the aircraft's response immediately. With both engines operational, the descent rate slowed dramatically. The nose came up slightly. The aircraft that had been falling was now flying again, genuinely flying, powered by 2 engines and sustained by the knowledge of a teenager who'd spent 3 years learning systems that nobody his age should have cared about. "We've got both engines," Reeves said, and for the first time in the last 20 minutes, his voice carried genuine relief. "I repeat, both engines are operational and responding normally." From his position alongside the aircraft, Major Stevens saw the navigation lights bright. He saw the aircraft's descent rate decrease on his instruments. He saw an impossible situation transform into something that might actually end with people surviving. "Outstanding," Stevens said. "Viper 11 has visual confirmation of both engines engaged. You've got power and altitude recovery. Recommend immediate vector to nearest suitable landing field." In seat 12C, Marcus Chen let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Around him, passengers were applauding. Someone was crying, several someones, actually. The businessman who'd been praying was saying something that might have been gratitude or might have been a prayer of thanks to whatever God he'd been negotiating with. But Marcus wasn't celebrating yet. They still had to land. They still had to survive the next phase. At 9,000 feet and climbing, Flight 447 was no longer in crisis. But the danger was far from over. The runway of Greeley Regional Airport appeared through the clouds like a strip of salvation, gray concrete stretching out across the Colorado landscape, flanked by emergency vehicles with flashing lights. Fire trucks, ambulances, police cars, everything positioned and ready for a disaster that might or might not happen. Captain James Reeves had been flying commercial aircraft for 37 years. He had made thousands of landings. He had brought aircraft down in thunderstorms, crosswinds, challenging weather conditions. He had landed on runways that were barely long enough and airports that were technically too small for a Boeing 737. But as he began his descent toward Greeley, his hands were steadier than they'd been in the previous 45 minutes of crisis. Because now he had 2 engines. He had power, he had control. What he didn't have was any margin for error. "Greeley Tower, Flight 447, he said into the radio. "We're on final approach. Request vectors for landing." "Flight 447, Greeley Tower," came the response. "You are cleared to land on runway 16 left. Emergency services standing by. Welcome to Greeley." Those last 2 words, "welcome to Greeley," seemed to carry the weight of everything that had just happened. This wasn't a routine landing. This was a miracle disguised as a standard approach and landing. Reeves adjusted the trim. The aircraft responded smoothly. Sarah was calling out the checklist items in her calm, measured voice. Landing gear down, flaps at approach setting, speed reducing as altitude decreased. Everything happening exactly as it should, exactly as it had been designed to happen. Behind them, in seat 12C, Marcus Chen was watching the ground approaching through the window. The fields of Colorado, the runway coming into focus, the reality of survival sinking in. They had done it. Against every odd, defying every probability, they had brought the aircraft back from the edge of catastrophe. The wheels touched down. It was the smoothest landing Marcus had ever experienced, textbook perfect, the kind of landing that you don't even feel. The aircraft's speed decreased. The landing gear absorbed the impact with mechanical grace. The reverse thrusters engaged with a roar, slowing the massive aircraft from 150 miles per hour to a gentle taxi speed. By the time Flight 447 came to a complete stop, 187 people had just been given a second chance at life. For a moment there was silence in the cabin, a profound, almost spiritual silence. Then someone started applauding. It was a passenger in the back of the plane, someone Marcus would never know. And then everyone was applauding. Passengers were standing, tears streaming down their faces, applauding the pilots, applauding survival, applauding the fact that they were alive. The elderly woman next to Marcus was gripping his arm, saying something that might have been gratitude or prayer. The businessman across the aisle was holding his phone, probably documenting the moment, probably already telling whoever was on the other end that he was alive, he'd survived, something impossible had just happened. Emergency responders rushed to the aircraft. The doors opened. The evacuation procedures began, though they were unnecessary. No one was injured. There were no flames. There was no disaster. Just 187 people walking off an aircraft that should have crashed into the mountains. Captain Reeves was waiting in the jetway when Marcus came off the plane. The captain was still in his uniform, still processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. When he saw Marcus, he moved toward him, and for a moment they just looked at each other, an experienced pilot and a teenager who'd saved his life. "Thank you," Reeves said simply. He placed his hand on Marcus' shoulder. "You saved us all, kid." Marcus didn't know what to say. The enormity of it was beyond his ability to express in words. So he just nodded, and Reeves squeezed his shoulder once more before being led away by emergency responders who needed to conduct interviews and investigations. The media attention came later. By evening, every news outlet in the country was running the story. Teenager saves 187 people using knowledge from his garage. The video of the landing went viral. The interview with Derek Thompson, the air traffic controller who'd believed a kid's message, went viral. Captain Reeves gave a press conference where he called Marcus Chen the bravest young man he'd ever met. Marcus High School became famous. His teachers were giving interviews. His classmates who'd previously ignored him were suddenly claiming he was their best friend. The attention was suffocating. His parents were proud but careful. His mother especially understood the danger of the spotlight. Fame was a distraction. Fame was a weight. What mattered was what came next. What came next was an email from Boeing Aerospace. At 28 years old, Marcus Chen was walking through the halls of Boeing's Seattle facility, and he no longer felt like an outsider. He had a PhD in aerospace engineering. He had spent 8 years working on aircraft safety systems. He had become one of the leading experts in the world on fuel injection system defects and electrical feedback loops. The company that had built Flight 447 wanted his knowledge. But more than that, they wanted to prevent what had happened from ever happening again. Marcus was part of a team that redesigned the fuel injection systems on hundreds of aircraft. His specifications, his research, his knowledge, his understanding of legacy systems and their failure modes became the standard across the industry. Aircraft that might have suffered the same defect were retrofitted with new systems. Procedures were updated. Pilot training was modified to include emergency sequences that never would have been considered before. The manufacturing defect that had nearly killed 187 people became a case study in aviation schools around the world. Aerospace engineering textbooks included his analysis. His call sign from the emergency, Eagle, given by Captain Reeves in the days after the crisis, had followed him into his professional career. His colleagues called him Eagle. His team referred to him as Eagle. When he walked into conference rooms, people nodded with the kind of respect usually reserved for people who'd spent decades in the field. Because he had done something that most engineers only dreamed of. He had taken theoretical knowledge, applied it in real time, and saved lives. He had proven that expertise doesn't come with an expiration date. Knowledge doesn't care about your age. Truth doesn't require a permission slip. 12 years after Flight 447, Marcus stood in a conference room at Boeing, presenting a new safety system to a room full of executives. The system was designed to prevent the exact kind of cascade failures that had nearly killed 187 people. It incorporated redundancies on top of redundancies. It included the kind of fail-safes that had been designed for aircraft from the 1960s, systems that had proven themselves over decades. "We're taking the best practices from the past," Marcus explained, "and integrating them with the technology of the present. Legacy knowledge combined with modern capabilities. That's how we ensure we never see this kind of failure again." One of the executives raised his hand. "How many lives do you think this system will save over the next 50 years? Marcus thought about the question carefully. He thought about Flight 447. He thought about 187 people who were alive because a teenager in seat 12C had paid attention in his father's garage. He thought about the unknown pilots, the unknown passengers on unknown flights, who would survive because of systems designed to prevent disasters that hadn't happened yet. "Thousands," he said finally. "At minimum, thousands. Maybe tens of thousands if the system is adopted across the entire commercial aviation industry." After the meeting, as Marcus was walking to his office, he passed a wall of photographs. Pictures of Boeing's greatest achievements, historic aircraft, pioneering flights. And there among the photographs was an image of Flight 447 landing at Greeley Regional Airport. The caption read, "Safety through knowledge, safety through courage, safety through human connection." Marcus paused in front of the photograph. He remembered seat 12C. He remembered the grinding sound of engines dying. He remembered the moment when belief had met engineering and created something impossible. He remembered being terrified and competent at the same time. He continued walking to his office, where the wall behind his desk displayed a single item, a framed printout of his message from seat 12C to air traffic control. The message that had started everything. The moment when a teenager decided to act despite every reason not to. On the frame, someone had written in elegant script, "I'm Eagle, I've got this." Marcus Chen, the man who saved 187 people at 28,000 feet, had become the engineer who prevents disasters on the ground.